All right, today's section, we're going to finish off genocide and human rights by looking at gender equality, and then we're going to start taking a look at global problems and challenges, particularly with the environment and global warming. All right, so if we take a look at gender equality, this has really become one of the big issues because those guys that had me remember for AP Human Geography, remember women are still probably globally the most exploited gender worldwide, particularly when we look at peripheral countries or what you guys would call third world countries. So one of the big things that's really come up is the UN in 1979 adopted what was called the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And this really fought against the abuses that women faced, essentially where they are treated as second-class citizens. One area that's been very successful and actually tends to be a really good investment are what's called microcredit loans. These are really small loans that investors will give to women in third world countries or second world countries like India, you can see here in the picture. And the loan is relatively small, about say $5,000, $2,000 to $5,000. But in these areas, it's enough for these women to actually start up businesses. And what's really amazing is that the microcredit loans have an incredible payback rate with interest. 98% of all these loans are actually repaid. Normally, the 2%, and if it does drop any lower in area, is related, believe it or not, to diseases that kill off the individual, so it prevents them from really repaying the loan. So this has really been a great way to allow women to have some autonomy, and also it is a good investment globally. Now, by 2015, there are only two nations in the world that do not allow women to vote. Okay, when we look at this, the World Health Organization has announced, following on March 8th in 2012, stating that women, one, could not own land or inherit property, were socially excluded, killed in honor killings, had their genitalia mutilated, were trafficked, had their mobility restricted, and were forced into early marriages. And here's a picture of a bride, Nalib, who is 13, and her husband is in his either late 20s or early 30s. So again, um, that some women are still having problems globally where all of this stuff actually does take place. Now, as we move away from gender equality, we're going to look at global challenges and we enter in the Green Revolution. Now, the Green Revolution is going to have two parts. It's going to have the post World War II portion, and then the Green Revolution goes into the 1970s version where we think of a more organic concept. The post World War II movement was focusing on ending global hunger, which it does. And it was achieved through crossbreeding, genetic engineering, new irrigation practices, new fertilizers, and new pesticides. The problem was nobody realized the long term effects that these would have on the environment as a whole. What happens is when we finally get to the 1970s, we actually started to see globally the damage that this stuff was actually doing. Chemicals pretty much damaged the soil, biodiversity suffered, which led to extinction or literally the wiping out of certain crops in certain regions. So, what happened is in the 1970s, the Green Revolution took on a new challenge where it tried to divert and change the damage that it was doing. One of the other problems, too, is a global warming. Pretty much most scientists actually agree that the burning of fossil fuels is altering the environment. Uh, Nations need to curb their carbon footprint and produce less material. And this is one of the reasons that we end up seeing globally more hurricanes, more droughts, and more flooding because of these massive fluctuations. Now, in an effort to fight it, one of the things that was attempted was what was called the Kyoto Protocol. It was created in 1997, and the attempt was to reduce the carbon emissions. The U.S. actually refused to sign this. India and China were not required to adhere to the strict limits since they had just really began to truly industrialize in the sense with particularly auto production. Later, then we had the Paris Agreement was created in 2015 to try and update it, and again, the U.S. and China both refused to sign these agreements to reducing carbon footprinting. So again, lots of issues with, of course, the United States. We're probably the largest consumer of fossil fuels in the world, and China is probably second or third, definitely within the top five. Now, again, Greenpeace was eventually formed, which is a non-government organization formed to battle the following, particularly deforestation, desertification, global warming, the killing of whales, and overfishing. And again, this you can see over on the right. The picture is a picture of the Aral Sea. It's the largest freshwater ocean in the world, or it used to be. The picture is of 1989. Because of a lot of the modified grains that were used to grow in the area, they began to drain off the Aral Sea to use it for irrigation. And it's really bizarre. You can actually Google pictures of the Aral Sea and see literally ships that look like they're sitting in the middle of the desert. Literally, I believe the water production loss has been over 80% in the Aral Sea, and it's actually really turned into a desert region now. One of the challenges that have tried to, again, stop soil erosion and deforestation is called the Greenbelt Movement. It was founded in 1977 and employs women to plant trees to stop deforestation and soil erosion in Kenya. And it's largely been successful and has actually grown larger since the 77 movement and been used in a number of African countries in the sub-Sahara. Now, again, some of the biggest problems that we've ended up seeing are, again, related to fossil fuels. And as a result of that, we've seen changes taking place where trying to incorporate more fuels that don't necessarily leave a carbon footprint. Wind, solar, and tidal and geothermal are all really popular ones. Again, they're not harmful to the environment and they work really well in areas. But the problem with that is most of these regions or most of these types of energies require specific parameters, and the investments on them can be incredibly expensive. The other is the nuclear. Nuclear, of course, can be incredibly scary depending on what happens. There have been three major incidents in the world. One in the United States called the 3 Mile Island incident. Took place in Pennsylvania, and it leaked roughly about 1 million gallons of low-level radioactive water out into the Pennsylvania water supply. There were no overt deaths as a result of this. The only statistic that was ever gathered is the region around where the leak occurred. They noticed a drop in wildlife and in human births. So they think that it kind of had a slight sterilization effect on the people living in that area, but no overt deaths. Of course, the biggest one and the scariest one was the Chernobyl accident in the Ukraine in 1989. This is when the reactor blew up, and the Soviets at the time were not using any type of backup redundant systems. So when the plant exploded, there was no actual outer protective shell, which most factories in the United States used to prevent this from happening. The area was highly irradiated. It is still considered hot today. If you go in the region, you're supposed to wear little radioactive cards that will actually start to change colors and make noise if you've actually overstayed and are starting to come near lethal doses of radiation. We don't know either how many people died. We do know that the people in the plant died, which I believe was right around 23 to 26. But estimates are unknown because the Soviets kept the media, had control over the media at that time. We've seen as low as 50,000 to I believe as high as 1.5 million died from radiation poisoning. The most recent was the Fukushima accident in Japan, and some of you guys might remember that was because of the tsunami and earthquakes off the coast, which actually caused the spillage. Again, problem with this one is we really have trouble separating who died from radiation and who simply died from being swept away in tidal waves and drowning. So again, this one though, not really an actual meltdown of the plant per se, but caused by natural disaster.